You know, I was here in Congress in 2008 when we had the economic crisis. It was a terrible time. Millions of people lost their jobs. Trillions of dollars of wealth gone. That crisis caught us by surprise. Let me ask you a question. What if your president, your senator, and your congressman knew it was coming? What if you knew when it was going to happen, why it was going to happen, and more importantly, what if they knew what they needed to do to stop it from happening and they had the time to stop it, but they chose to do nothing about it because it wasn't good politics? What would you think of that person? It'd be immoral. This coming debt crisis is the most predictable crisis we've ever had in this country. And look what's happening. This is why we're acting. This is why we're leading. This is why we're proposing and passing out of the House a budget to fix this problem so we can save our country for ourselves and for our children's future.
We have a $99.4 trillion unfunded liability. Our government is making promises to Americans that it has no way of accounting for them. And so you're saying, yeah, we're stabilizing it, but we're not fixing it in the long run. That means we're just going to keep lying to people. We're going to keep all these empty promises going. And so what we're saying is, in order to avert a debt crisis, I mean, you're the Treasury Secretary of all. If we can't make good on our bonds in the future, who's going to invest in our country? We do not want to have a debt crisis. And so it comes down to confidence and trajectory. Do we have confidence that we're getting our fiscal situation under control, that we're preventing the debt from getting at these catastrophic levels? And if you go back to the preceding chart, number 13, you're showing that you have no plan to get this debt under control. You're saying we'll stabilize it, but then it's just going to shoot back up. And so my argument is that's Europe. That is bringing us toward a European debt crisis, because we're showing the world, the credit markets, future seniors, people who are organizing their lives around the promises that are being made to them today. We don't have a plan to make good on this. And
Mr.
so,
Chairman, as I said, I don't. Maybe we're not disagreeing in the sense that I made it absolutely clear that what our budget does is get our deficits down to a sustainable path over the budget,
take back off.
over the budget window. And why? Let's now talk to the why do they take off again?
Thank you. Okay, I brought up page 146 in your budget, which is your S1 budget totals. And when you take a look at this, I just find this amazing. You've got your budget totals here, which by your own admission, from your own budget director, you're a smart guy, you've got smart economists over there. All of them say that for the medium and long run, budget deficits got to get below 3% of GDP. Yet this budget plan you're bringing to us doesn't even get close to it.
Exactly, you're exactly right. And we've said clearly
right,
that.
So since I have 3 minutes,
right. Okay, sorry.
So you got this warning under here. It's like the warning on a cigarette pack. You've got this little magic box underneath your budget totals that says, we're going to have a commission do it. We're going to have this partisan commission, 2-to-1 ratio of Democrats over Republicans, that will give us a report after the election. Vote on
not a 2-to-1 ratio. That's not fair. That's not a 2-to-1 ratio. And let me say it slightly differently. What we're saying is we're going to solve our part of the mess we inherited.
Okay.
So we inherited a structural deficit, and to bring that down, we're going to have to work
Then why don't you do it in your budget? If you're going to solve this problem, why don't you're the president? You guys run the government. If you're going to solve our fiscal situation, why don't you do that? Why don't you give us a budget that actually gets the deficits to a sustainable level? Let me just
just one more thing. One more thing. Let's do it again.
Let me read a quote. I got 3 minutes. Let me read a quote from Mr. Orszag in the Wall Street Journal, which I completely agree with. The unusual situation that the government finds itself in, with other countries willing to finance the U.S. debt at low rates, won't last. And he added, when it flips, the question is how do you get ahead of that to avoid the downward spiral of rising interest rates, the plunging dollar, and a sinking economy? I couldn't have said it better myself.
I think it's a good quote, too. I agree with that.
The vigilantes in the bond markets are going to get us, and the American people are going to get hurt. For those of us who served in Congress for a while, we were there in 2008 when we had a financial crash. And then we watched a recession start. We saw millions of people, friends, families, constituents, lose their jobs. We saw trillions of dollars of wealth just vanish because we had a great recession. You know, consequently, usually the bigger the recession you have in this country, the bigger the recovery. Where's the recovery? But I want to tell you something. When that 2008 financial crisis happened, it caught us all by surprise. We didn't see it coming. And so ugly crisis legislation emerged from that. I want to ask you a question. What if your congressman, your senator, your president saw that financial crash coming, knew it was going to happen, basically when it was going to happen, why it was going to happen, but more importantly, what if your representative in Congress, your president, knew what needed to be done to prevent it from happening and had the time to do so, but decided not to because it just wasn't good politics? What would you think of him? You wouldn't like him. That's where we are right now. We have the most predictable, most preventable economic crisis in our history, and what are we doing? We're playing politics. We have a leadership deficit in Washington right now. We have a debt crisis coming. We know that government cannot keep spending money we don't have. And yet, we see what we are doing to our children and our grandchildren. We know without a shred of doubt we're giving them a lower standard of living, less prosperity, less opportunities. We're living at their expense right now. And we know doing it this way is hurting our economy today. It's costing us jobs now.
Appearing before our committee yet again today. Yesterday, the CBO released its long-term budget outlook. This report throws harsh light on the challenges we face, and it sounds an alarm that too many in Washington have been ignoring for far too long. The federal government will race across a dangerous tipping point this year. According to CBO, total U.S. debt will reach 100% of GDP. Our debt will have eclipsed the size of our entire economy. Economists who have studied sovereign debt tell us that letting total debt rise above 90% of GDP creates a drag on economic growth and intensifies the risk of a debt-fueled economic crisis. The CBO is candid about the increasing likelihood of this crisis, and the report states, quote, "Such a crisis would confront policymakers with extremely difficult choices and probably have a very significant negative impact on the country," unquote. This quote demonstrates CBO's flair for the understatement. A sudden fiscal crisis would be a complete catastrophe for this country. Families and businesses would bear the full brunt of the painful consequences. If the nation ultimately experienced a panicked run on its debt, policymakers would be forced to make immediate and painful fiscal adjustments, like the austerity programs that have stoked the riots in Greece. This would mean massive tax increases on working families and steep benefit cuts that hit our most vulnerable citizens the hardest. The CBO is a nonpartisan agency, so it does not take a position on what would be required to prevent this crisis. That the White House isn't even trying to solve this problem. When you strip away all the budget gimmicks and the accounting tricks, they just gave us a budget that has a net spending increase of $1.5 trillion and a tax increase of $1.9 trillion. It's not leadership. If you just did nothing, the debt is set to go up 78%. If you pass the president's budget, it goes up 76%. So what they're doing is they're not leading. They're ducking responsibility, and that threatens our economy, and that will make us more like Greece. Here's the issue. If we keep kicking the can down the road and we don't face up to these great fiscal challenges we have a debt-fueled economic crisis ahead of us. And if we don't address them now, then it gets ugly like Greece, and then you have to impose the kind of austerity that they're imposing in Greece. We're saying, let's fix this now while we can do it on our own terms. I remember vividly October 2008. You watched the credit spreads all over the place go wild. We had the chairman of the Federal Reserve, we had the Treasury Secretary come up to the Hill in a panic, talking about a crash, a crisis, a deflationary spiral. And then we engaged in crisis management in Congress. And we came together in Congress and put together a very deeply flawed plan to get out of that crisis. That came up and got us by surprise. Now, we can go back now with hindsight and untangle the mess, but that was a surprise crisis. This one's not. This, I say, is the most predictable crisis we've ever had hitting our economy. It's a forthcoming debt crisis. We know it. We see the problem on the horizons in Europe, Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal. We know a debt crisis is coming. We know that the interest compounds viciously once interest rates go up. And so this is something that is obvious, easy to predict, and therefore something we should tackle. And what's crazy about this is we have yet to muster the political will to actually prevent this crisis from occurring.
Alice Ripley.
I agree with that. We've actually known about this.
News first, which is the reason you see the futures lower this morning is that the Euro finance ministers did not come out and say, okay, we're going to give Greece the 12 billion euro, $17 billion loan tranche that we've already agreed to, that we eventually are going to give them, but we're not going to give it to them today. They had, with their verbiage last week, suggested that maybe that was going to be the case. So the markets are clearly disappointed that that uncertainty is not cleared up, because they have said they're going to delay that payment until they know the results of the referendum, the confidence vote on the Prime Minister, and also whether or not the Parliament is actually going to pass the $28 billion austerity package, and they're not going to vote on that 28th. So we have some time here. Greece needs the money because they've got debt payments due in July, and the country doesn't want to go bankrupt, and most of Europe doesn't want to go bankrupt. In the meantime, the Greek people still extremely angry. We were at a very large protest last night, thousands and thousands of people. A lot of them were retirees, elderly, that have seen their pensions cut in just the last few months. People who thought they were going to be able to retire earlier and haven't been able to, and are worried. They said, we're willing to work till we're 65. The problem is that, you know, people don't want to, companies don't want to hire older people. They're going to hire younger people who are cheaper, so they're worried about having to find a job at the age of 55. So the turmoil here continues. The people here are very angry, and they're starting to get very smart about the fact that the country's never, in the end, going to be able to pay back this debt. And so why should they be suffering so much? I don't think they understand, Joe, that they're going to suffer no matter what, because the cuts have to happen regardless of what the outcome is for the rest of Europe.
All right.
This is our point.
Yep.
This is our point. Look, the whole point of this budget we put out there is let's preempt that.
Right.
You know, what happens with austerity is you cut current seniors. I mean, the people who get hurt the first and the worst under a debt crisis are the people who need the government the most, the poor, the seniors. Our whole point is preempt and prevent that.
Your preferred outcome of this would be having the IMF involved and at the same time having Europe offering these preferential rates.
At the same rate as the IMF, in other words, back it up, the same way as they did in Latvia. And as they say, Greece is basically meeting the conditions that the IMF would impose, and therefore, if you have an IMF program which is backed further by a European contribution, then I think you would be under straight. But right now, because of this uncertainty, the market is going against you, and Germany is saying that you have to borrow at the market. That would be a trap. Greece into a hole. And that hole, that trap, is really the opposite of a bubble. It's the negative of a bubble. So we just had a bubble which has led to a financial crisis in 2008, and we are not out of the woods. In other words, what this conference is basically saying, we haven't yet corrected the imbalances which have created the crash of 2008. And right now, the problem with Greece and with the euro is at the center of the drama.
But it does seem that there's no clear solution in sight that the markets believe. So how do you make the markets follow what Greece is trying to do?